Imagine being the leader of a massive struggling nation and discovering inspiration in the most unlikely place. A tiny island country that most people wouldn't expect to have much influence. This is the story of Deng Xiaoping, China's important leader, and his visit to Singapore in 1978, a moment that would change the course of history for China. It's a tale of unexpected allies, bold ideas, and a partnership that helped transform China into the economic powerhouse we know today. By the end of this video, you'll discover 3 powerful lessons from their exchanges lessons that we can apply to our everyday lives. Chapter 1. The Blueprint for Change. Deng Xiaoping wasn't your typical revolutionary. Born in 1904, he grew up in a time of great turmoil in China. He studied in France as a young man, where he was introduced to communist ideas that would shape his future. Deng returned to China and joined the Communist Party, eventually fighting alongside Mao Zedong in the Chinese Civil War. However, Deng stood apart from other revolutionaries because he was a pragmatist that cared more about what worked than sticking to strict ideological beliefs. This practical mindset would later shape his vision for China's future, making him one of the most influential leaders in modern Chinese history. Chapter 2. China's Struggles. In 1978, to understand the importance of Deng's trip to Singapore, we first need to look at China in 1978. China faced immense challenges after decades of political and economic turmoil. The Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962, aimed at rapidly industrializing the country, led to widespread famine and poverty, particularly in rural areas. The Cultural Revolution, 1966-1976, further destabilized the country, purging intellectuals and professionals, closing schools, and causing widespread distrust in the government. By 1978, China had a severe shortage of skilled workers, as well as a bureaucratic system paralyzed by fear. Agriculture, still the backbone of China's economy, was inefficient due to the commune system, where farmers lacked incentives to increase productivity. Food shortages were common, and rural poverty remained rampant. Industrial development, largely state-controlled, suffered from outdated technology and a lack of innovation, further stifling economic growth. Factories focused more on meeting political quotas than on improving quality or productivity. Social discontent was growing, especially in rural areas where the gap between the coastal cities and the inland regions was widening. Urban workers were also frustrated by low wages and poor living conditions. Additionally, China's diplomatic isolation limited its access to foreign trade and technology, leaving the country behind in global economic development. By 1978, China was at a crossroads, struggling with economic stagnation, social inequality, and the lingering effects of Mao Zedong's policies. Deng, who had just risen to power, knew that drastic change was needed. He was determined to modernize China, but the question was how. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Visit. In November 1978, Deng began a tour of Southeast Asia, including a stop in Singapore. At the time, many in China viewed Singapore as a puppet of Western powers, assuming it was an economically struggling colony. But when Deng arrived, he was taken aback by what he saw. Singapore was thriving. It had a strong economy, modern infrastructure, and most importantly, social stability, something Deng valued deeply. What impressed him even more was that Singapore's population was mostly ethnic Chinese, descendants of immigrants from southern China. If Singapore, a tiny island, could achieve such success, why couldn't China? During his 3-day visit, Deng engaged in intense discussions with Lee Kuan Yew. Despite their very different backgrounds, Deng the communist revolutionary and Lee the English-educated capitalist found common ground. Both leaders were pragmatic and had experienced colonial rule, so they understood the complexities of building a nation. At one dinner, Lee famously told Deng, "We, the Singapore Chinese, were the descendants of illiterate landless peasants from Guangdong and Fujian in southern China. There was nothing that Singapore had done that China could not do, and do better." This statement stuck with Deng and inspired him to embark on a bold new course for China. Chapter 4. Learning from Singapore. Upon returning to China, Deng launched a series of reforms that would change the country forever. One of his first major initiatives was creating 4 special economic zones, SEZs, in 1980. These areas, which included Shenzhen near Hong Kong, were designed to attract foreign investment and experiment with market-driven policies. The SEZs were heavily influenced by what Deng had seen in Singapore, an example of how a small nation could draw foreign companies and capital to fuel rapid growth. Deng even invited Singapore's former Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, to help advise these zones. Deng's reforms went beyond just the SEZs. He introduced the household responsibility system in agriculture, which allowed farmers to keep a portion of their harvest for themselves, giving them an incentive to produce more. He also encouraged private businesses to flourish and opened the door to foreign investment. These changes, known as the reform and opening up policies, marked a dramatic shift from China's past focus on central planning and isolation. Deng's vision for China drew heavily on Singapore's model, combining government control with market-oriented reforms to drive economic growth. Chapter 5. The Pushback. By the early 1990s, Deng faced resistance from conservative factions within the Communist Party, who feared that his reforms were destabilizing China. In response, Deng, then 88 years old, undertook his famous Southern Tour in 1992. During this tour, he visited southern China's rapidly growing cities and strongly advocated for continuing and accelerating reforms. Deng specifically pointed to Singapore as an example, declaring, "We should learn from Singapore and manage things even better than they do." This endorsement led to a wave of Chinese officials visiting Singapore to study its governance, economic policies, and urban development strategies. One of the key lessons China took from Singapore was how to maintain strong government control while embracing economic openness. In Singapore, the ruling People's Action Party, PAP, held tight political control while allowing market forces to drive economic growth. This model appealed to Chinese leaders, who were keen to reform the economy without losing their hold on power. China saw that it was possible to achieve rapid growth and development without adopting Western-style democracy, which often led to instability in other developing nations. Another lesson China took from Singapore was the importance of meritocracy in government. Singapore had a highly efficient civil service that recruited the best and brightest minds. The country's low tolerance for corruption also stood out, as Lee Kuan Yew believed that a clean government was essential for long-term success. China, in turn, began focusing more on promoting capable officials and cracking down on corruption, although this has been an ongoing challenge for such a large and diverse country. Chapter 6. Society Restructuring. Singapore's success in urban planning and public housing also caught China's attention. The city-state had managed to provide affordable housing to most of its population while maintaining a clean, efficient urban environment. China started adopting similar practices, particularly in its growing cities and SEZs, to address its own housing shortages and urban challenges. One of the reasons Singapore's model resonated so well with China was its grounding in Confucian values, which emphasized social harmony, respect for authority, and collective welfare. Lee Kuan Yew had promoted these Asian values in Singapore, and China found them appealing as they aligned with its own cultural traditions. This approach gave China an alternative to the Western, liberal democratic model, offering a way to modernize without compromising social stability or traditional values. Singapore's focus on education also left a deep impression on China. The city-state had invested heavily in education, particularly in fields like science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. China soon followed suit, expanding access to higher education and focusing on the skills needed for a modern, competitive economy. This emphasis on education has been one of the driving forces behind China's rise as a technological and economic power in recent decades. Chapter 7. Challenges and Criticisms. While China learned a great deal from Singapore, there are limits to how much a small city-state's model can apply to a vast and diverse country like China. Critics argue that what worked for Singapore may not be feasible on a larger scale, especially in areas like political control and social policies. Both China and Singapore have faced criticism for their restrictions on political freedoms and civil liberties. While their leaders argue that these restrictions are necessary for maintaining stability and growth, many human rights organizations contend that these policies come at too great a cost to individual rights and freedoms. Despite their economic successes, both China and Singapore struggle with rising income inequality. This growing divide between rich and poor remains one of the major challenges for both countries, raising concerns about the long-term sustainability of their development models. As China's economy has grown, the relationship between China and Singapore has evolved. While China once viewed Singapore as a teacher, it now sees the city-state as both a partner and a potential competitor in certain areas. Singapore, for its part, has had to carefully balance its relationship with China while maintaining strong ties with other global powers, particularly the United States. This balancing act hasn't always been easy, leading to occasional tensions between Singapore and China, such as during disputes over the South China Sea. The story of Deng Xiaoping's visit to Singapore is a powerful reminder that good ideas know no borders. What started as an unexpected trip turned into a key moment that shaped the future of China. Deng Xiaoping's willingness to learn from a small island nation helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and positioned China as a global economic force. Here are the 3 lessons that we can draw from their exchanges and apply to our everyday lives. Lesson 1. Embrace pragmatism over ideology. Deng Xiaoping's leadership demonstrated the importance of focusing on what works rather than being bound by strict ideologies. Instead of adhering solely to communist doctrines, Deng adopted practical strategies that propelled China's economic growth. In everyday life, we can apply this by being flexible in our approach to challenges. Sometimes, the best solutions come from being open to new ideas, even those that seem unconventional. Lesson 2. Learn from others, regardless of size. Despite China's vast size and Singapore's small stature, Deng saw value in learning from Singapore's successes. This teaches us the importance of seeking knowledge and inspiration from diverse sources, regardless of how unlikely they may seem. In our personal and professional lives, it's essential to remain humble and recognize that wisdom can come from anywhere, even places or people we might initially overlook. Lesson 3. Balance tradition with innovation. Deng and Lee Kuan Yew both managed to modernize their countries while still respecting their cultural heritage. This balance helped ensure sustainable progress. In our own lives, we can blend respect for traditions with a willingness to embrace change and innovation, ensuring that we move forward without losing sight of what matters most. What do you guys think about their interactions? Did you think Deng Xiaoping made the right move for copying part of Singapore model? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.